Have you ever walked away from a conversation with someone feeling inexplicably unsettled? Not because of what they said, but because of something you couldn't quite name. An invisible tension, a subtle wrongness that your rational mind couldn't explain, but your instincts detected immediately? Carl Jung spent decades investigating these intuitive responses. What he discovered would fundamentally change how we understand the hidden dangers lurking in human relationships. Jung realized that our unconscious mind operates like a sophisticated detection system, picking up on psychological patterns that our conscious awareness completely misses. These patterns, he found, could reveal not just profound truths about others, but serve as early warning systems for psychological manipulation, emotional vampirism, and relationships that could systematically destroy our sense of reality. Over 40 years of clinical practice, Jung documented 5 psychological patterns so dangerous that he believed recognizing them was essential for psychological survival. These weren't just academic observations, they were survival maps for navigating the treacherous landscape of human relationships. Today, I'm going to reveal Jung's most disturbing discoveries about the human psyche, and why the people who seem most normal on the surface might pose the greatest threat to your psychological well-being. The case that opened Jung's eyes. Jung described encountering patients who would sit across from him, trembling as they described lives under siege. These individuals, he observed, saw deception everywhere, in innocent comments from loved ones, in casual conversations with friends, in simple interactions with strangers. They would express with growing intensity, "Everyone around me is manipulative and dishonest. I can see through their lies, their manipulations. Why can't they just be honest?" Jung listens carefully, not just to her words, but to something else. The way she reframes his questions, twists his observations, and systematically reinterprets everything he says to fit her narrative of persecution. As sessions continue, Jung realizes something disturbing. This woman, who sees manipulation everywhere, is herself extraordinarily manipulative. She consistently attributes to others the exact same behaviors she exhibits herself, with one crucial difference: she cannot see her own actions at all. It's as if she's psychologically blind to her own manipulative tendencies while possessing laser-like vision for detecting them in everyone else. Jung had discovered what would become one of his most important insights: shadow projection, the unconscious process by which we see in others what we cannot bear to acknowledge in ourselves. The shadow, Jung explained, contains all those aspects of ourselves we find unacceptable: our capacity for cruelty, selfishness, manipulation, weakness. When we refuse to acknowledge these aspects within ourselves, they don't disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious like psychological poison, eventually erupting outward in the form of projections onto others. The woman in Jung's office wasn't just difficult, she was dangerous. Because shadow projectors don't simply disagree with you about facts. They inhabit a distorted reality where you become the repository for everything they cannot accept about themselves. And they will fight to maintain this distortion with the desperation of someone whose psychological survival depends on never seeing themselves clearly. Jung documented how shadow projectors consistently cast themselves as victims of others' negative behaviors while remaining completely blind to their own identical actions. They see manipulation everywhere except when they're the ones manipulating. They detect dishonesty in every interaction except their own. They perceive cruelty in others' words while being unable to hear the cruelty in their own words. What makes shadow projection particularly insidious is the projector's absolute conviction. They're not consciously lying or deliberately creating drama. They genuinely perceive in you what they cannot acknowledge in themselves.
This conviction creates a distorted reality so compelling that it can make you question your own perceptions and sanity. Jung realized he wasn't just observing individual pathology. He was witnessing how unconscious people systematically recruit others into their internal psychological wars, turning relationships into battlefields for conflicts that exist entirely within their own psyche.
The Master of Masks. Jung wrote extensively about individuals who had achieved what appeared to be perfect social mastery. He described patients who arrived impeccably presented, spoke with precise eloquence, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to say exactly what each situation required. Jung was initially impressed. Here was someone who had clearly mastered the social world, who navigated complex interpersonal dynamics with apparent ease and sophistication. But as their sessions continued, Jung felt increasingly unsettled by something he couldn't initially identify. There was no spontaneity in this man's responses, no genuine surprise, no moments of authentic confusion or vulnerability. Every emotion seemed calculated, every reaction perfectly calibrated for maximum social effect. Jung began to suspect he wasn't meeting a person at all, but rather a performance so elaborate that even the performer had forgotten there might be someone underneath. Jung called this phenomenon total persona identification, when someone becomes so completely merged with their social mask that they lose all connection to their authentic self. The persona, Jung explained, is the necessary interface between our inner world and social reality. We all need masks to function in different contexts, but when someone becomes entirely identified with their persona, they've committed what Jung considered a form of psychological suicide. This businessman had sacrificed his authentic self on the altar of social success, creating a facade so convincing that he'd forgotten he was wearing one. But Jung's most disturbing discovery was what happened to the rejected aspects of personality in such cases. They don't disappear. They accumulate in the shadow, becoming increasingly volatile and unpredictable. Jung observed that people with rigid personas often experienced what he termed shadow eruptions, sudden, inexplicable moments when all that repressed authenticity would explode in destructive ways. The more perfect the mask, the more chaotic the shadow beneath. This explained why some apparently exemplary individuals were capable of shocking cruelty or sudden psychological breakdowns that seemed to come from nowhere. The businessman Jung was treating eventually experienced such an eruption during a company merger. Despite years of perfect professional conduct, he suddenly began exhibiting paranoid behavior, accusing colleagues of conspiracies and making increasingly erratic decisions. The psychological tension of maintaining such an elaborate false self had finally exceeded his capacity to contain it. Jung realized that total persona identification created individuals who were psychological time bombs. Their repressed authenticity would eventually demand expression, often in the most destructive ways possible. These people weren't just emotionally unavailable, they were psychologically dangerous because their suppressed shadow could erupt without warning, causing devastating harm to themselves and everyone around them.
The divine delusion. Jung documented cases of what he called psychological inflation, when someone's personal ego becomes identified with transpersonal archetypal forces. He described patients who had experienced what they believed were profound spiritual awakenings, but instead of developing humility and wisdom, had become convinced they were chosen by divine forces to deliver ultimate truth to humanity. The man didn't claim personal superiority in crude terms. Instead, he positioned himself as a humble vessel for cosmic wisdom. "I don't speak for myself," he would say with apparent modesty. "I speak for truth itself." When challenged or questioned, he didn't defend his personal opinions. He defended the cosmic order he believed he represented. Jung recognized this as one of the most dangerous psychological states he'd ever encountered. The inflated individual loses touch with their fundamental humanity, no longer experiencing themselves as limited human beings capable of error, but as direct channels for absolute truth, divine will, or cosmic justice. What made this pattern particularly insidious was its appeal to others. The inflated person radiates an extraordinary sense of certainty that can be deeply attractive to those struggling with life's inherent uncertainty. They offer what Jung called cheap grace, the illusion that someone has figured out life's fundamental mysteries and can share this wisdom without the recipient needing to do their own psychological work. Jung documented how inflated individuals interpret any disagreement or criticism not as potentially useful human feedback, but as resistance to the cosmic forces they represent. Opposition isn't seen as legitimate disagreement between limited human perspectives, but as darkness opposing light, ignorance challenging wisdom, evil confronting good. The inflated person becomes incapable of genuine self-doubt or intellectual humility. They've transcended the messy uncertainty that characterizes authentic human consciousness, achieving instead a kind of psychological rigidity that masquerades as spiritual authority. Jung's most disturbing observation was how psychological inflation affected the person's capacity for genuine relationship. Because they no longer experience themselves as fallible humans, they cannot engage in the mutual vulnerability that authentic intimacy requires. Instead, they relate to others as a teacher to students, a prophet to followers, or a parent to children, never as one limited human being to another. This creates relationships based entirely on psychological inequality, where the inflated person maintains their sense of specialness by keeping others in positions of dependence or inferiority. Jung realized that inflation wasn't just a personal psychological problem. It was a relational pathology that systematically corrupted every human connection the inflated person attempted to form. When ancient forces take over. Jung wrote about witnessing what he considered perhaps the most unsettling psychological phenomenon: archetypal possession. He described observing patients who seemed to transform during sessions, the same person physically, but with something fundamental shifting in their presence, their voice, the very quality of their consciousness. Jung realized he was witnessing what happened when an individual's consciousness becomes completely overtaken by what he called archetypal forces, primordial psychological patterns that exist in the collective unconscious of humanity. These archetypes, the mother, the father, the warrior, the sage, the shadow, normally provide psychological richness and depth when integrated consciously. But when they possess someone's consciousness, the person loses their individual flexibility and becomes a rigid channel for forces beyond their control. The possessed individual loses what Jung considered most essentially human: the capacity for self-reflection, nuance, and conscious choice. Instead of thinking and feeling as a complex individual, they become a mouthpiece for archetypal imperatives that operate according to their own logic, not human reason or compassion. Jung observed several warning signs of archetypal possession. The person's normal psychological flexibility disappears, replaced by rigid identification with a single archetypal pattern. They might embody the unquestionable savior, the relentless warrior, the perpetual victim, or the infallible judge. Their speech takes on a monolithic quality, as if they're reciting universal truths rather than sharing personal perspectives. Most unnervingly, there's often a change in their eyes, a strange intensity that suggests someone is looking out from behind them, someone who isn't quite the individual person you thought you knew. What makes archetypal possession particularly dangerous is that archetypes contain extreme polarities. The savior archetype encompasses both redemptive compassion and destructive fanaticism. The warrior contains both noble protection and brutal aggression. When someone becomes completely identified with an archetype, they will inevitably manifest its shadow aspects, while remaining unconscious of the contradiction. Jung documented cases where individuals possessed by archetypal forces committed acts completely contrary to their normal character and conscious values. A gentle, compassionate person possessed by the warrior archetype might become capable of shocking cruelty. Someone possessed by the savior archetype might systematically destroy the lives of those they claim to be helping. The possessed person experiences these actions not as personal choices, but as cosmic necessities. They're not being cruel, they're serving justice. They're not being manipulative, they're facilitating awakening. They're not being destructive, they're clearing away illusions. Jung realized that archetypal possession represented the temporary death of individual human consciousness. The person becomes a puppet of forces that operate according to their own inexorable logic, without regard for human limitation, relationship, or genuine care.
The prison of repetition. Perhaps Jung's most heartbreaking discovery involved what he termed the compulsion to repeat. Individuals trapped in invisible psychological prisons, unconsciously recreating the same painful scenarios throughout their lives while remaining genuinely baffled by these recurring patterns. One of Jung's most memorable cases involved a woman who consistently found herself in relationships where she felt betrayed and abandoned. Different partners, different circumstances, different decades of her life, but somehow the same devastating script would play out. Initial idealization, gradual disillusionment, eventual betrayal, and final abandonment. What made her case particularly tragic was her genuine surprise each time the pattern repeated. She would describe each relationship as if it were a completely unprecedented series of unfortunate coincidences, never recognizing her unconscious role in orchestrating outcomes that felt both devastating and strangely familiar. Jung realized this woman wasn't consciously choosing these situations. She was responding to what he called unthought knowns, formative experiences so early, traumatic, or fundamental that they had never become conscious, but nevertheless organized all subsequent experience according to their emotional logic. Through careful analysis, Jung discovered that this woman's father had followed precisely the same pattern: initial intense attention and apparent devotion, followed by gradual emotional withdrawal and eventual abandonment when she most needed his presence. Her unconscious mind, Jung realized, had developed a template for love based on this early experience, and she was unconsciously seeking partners who could recreate this familiar emotional climate. But Jung's most disturbing insight was how individuals trapped in repetition compulsions unconsciously recruit others to play specific roles in their internal dramas. Without realizing it, the people around them become actors in psychological scripts written long before the current relationship began.
The woman would unconsciously select partners with the capacity to abandon her, then behave in subtle ways that activated their tendency toward emotional withdrawal. She would interpret neutral behaviors as signs of impending betrayal, creating the very tension and conflict that would eventually drive her partners away. Then, she would experience their departure as confirmation that love always leads to abandonment, never recognizing her unconscious role in creating this outcome. Jung observed that people trapped in repetition compulsions unconsciously emit what we might call psychological signals, subtle behavioral cues that attract precisely those individuals who can help them recreate their original trauma scenarios. They have an almost magnetic ability to find, in any group of people, those who will play the complementary roles their unconscious scripts require. The danger for others lies in becoming unwittingly cast in these dramas. You might find yourself playing the abandoner, the persecutor, or the rescuer in a story that began decades before you met this person. Jung documented how entire families and social groups could become organized around one person's unconscious repetition compulsion, with everyone playing assigned roles in a tragedy whose origin no one understood. The psychology of protection. Jung didn't simply catalog these dangerous patterns. He developed sophisticated methods for protecting oneself from psychological manipulation and contamination. His approach was based on what he called conscious differentiation, the ability to distinguish between your authentic responses and reactions triggered by others' unconscious material. When encountering shadow projection, Jung taught his patients to recognize that the accusations being made revealed the accuser's internal landscape, not objective truth about the accused. The key was learning not to absorb these projections while also not becoming defensive in ways that confirmed the projector's distorted worldview. With persona-identified individuals, Jung emphasized the importance of not becoming complicit in maintaining their false front. This meant being willing to acknowledge the artificial quality of the interaction rather than pretending everything was normal. Jung observed that authentic people often felt compelled to collude with others' personas to avoid social awkwardness, but this collusion ultimately enabled the continuation of psychological falseness. For psychological inflation, Jung developed what he called deflation techniques, gentle but consistent ways of introducing human limitation and uncertainty into interactions with inflated individuals. This didn't mean attacking their insights or beliefs directly, rather modeling the kind of humble uncertainty that characterizes genuine wisdom. With archetypally possessed individuals, Jung's advice was more cautionary. Maintain maximum distance while the possession lasted, since the person was temporarily not operating from individual human consciousness and therefore couldn't engage in genuine relationship. With repetition compulsions, Jung taught the importance of recognizing when you were being recruited into someone else's unconscious drama and refusing to play the assigned role, even when this refusal created significant social or emotional intensity. Jung's ultimate protection principle was deceptively simple. Trust your felt sense of something being off in human interactions, even when you couldn't rationally explain your discomfort. He believed that our unconscious minds are extraordinarily sophisticated at detecting psychological dysfunction in others, often long before our conscious minds can articulate what they're sensing. The goal, Jung emphasized, wasn't to become paranoid or hypervigilant, but to develop what he called conscious naivety, the ability to remain open and caring toward others while maintaining clear boundaries against psychological manipulation and contamination. Jung's final insight was that these dangerous patterns weren't rare aberrations, but common features of unconscious human psychology. Learning to recognize them wasn't about becoming judgmental or withdrawn from human relationship, but about developing the discernment necessary for authentic intimacy with those capable of genuine psychological health. As Jung aged and reflected on decades of clinical work, he reached a sobering conclusion. The most dangerous people aren't those who are consciously malicious, but those who are unconsciously possessed by psychological forces they cannot see or control. These individuals can cause tremendous harm while believing they're doing good, destroy relationships while thinking they're preserving them, and spread psychological toxicity while convinced they're healing the world. Your discomfort around certain people isn't a flaw in your perception. It's your unconscious mind's early warning system functioning exactly as it should, protecting you from psychological dangers your rational mind hasn't yet learned to recognize. If you've recognized any of these patterns in your own relationships, remember that awareness itself begins the transformation process. Jung believed that consciousness was our species' most powerful evolutionary tool, and learning to see these hidden psychological dynamics clearly is perhaps the most important skill we can develop for creating authentic, healthy human connections.